History teaches us that slave labor is the fastest way to accumulate wealth. What is slave labor? Slave labor is having someone work for free in the interest of someone else. So imagine having to work 100 yards of land with no help. Let's say that it would take 100 hours to work your 100 yards of land. But now, let's take that same 100 yards of land. Only now, you have 20 people working the land for you. While it would take you 100 hours to work the land by yourself, it would only take 5 hours for 20 people to work the land for you. Not only would it take them less time to work the land, more hands means that 20 times the amount of land could be worked in the same time that it takes for one person to work it. To top that off, let's say that $1 could be earned for every 1 yard worked. The hard-working individual would make a total of $100 in 100 hours. Does that sound good? Well, in that same time, the person with the 20 slaves could make $2,000 without lifting a finger. As you examine history, you'll find that some of our Native American ancestors, some of our African ancestors, and yes, some of our African ancestors that were living in America, so-called African Americans, gave up fighting the white man and his game and joined the white man in playing his game. These video clips that I'm about to show you will help you understand that there is nothing moral about playing the white man's game of capitalism. And even if you change white capitalism to black capitalism, it still stands for wealth over health. You must remember that capitalism is based on exploitation, and slave labor is the fastest way to accumulate wealth. Cheap labor helps to sustain the wealth accumulated by slave labor. And once you accept white civilization, you accept that you must also participate in slavery or exploitation of those desperate enough to work in your best interest, even if working for you contradicts their own interests. Please feel free to subscribe or unsubscribe. Feel free to type your comments, negative or positive. We're not here to make friends. We are here to make you think. Because once the black man and woman's mind is free, their bodies will be soon to follow. This has been Daku Akabo Wa'akatu.
The slave owner was actually a black colonist in Virginia. Anthony Johnson had once been an indentured servant who had completed his term of service and earned enough to buy out his wife's contract. He would eventually go on to import African slaves, earning 250 acres of land for his work. Washington required his overseers to ensure that every laborer do as much in the 24 hours as their strength, without endangering the health or constitution, will allow. Slavery in South Carolina, perhaps as a consequence, looked more like slavery in the West Indies than in Virginia. The heat and intensity of rice cultivation was also much harsher than found in the tobacco fields of Virginia. As a Charleston merchant, Samuel Everly stated,
I am positive that the commodity can't be produced by white people because the work is too laborious, the heat very intense, and the whites can't work in the wet at that season as Negroes do.
Rice cultivation was certainly grueling work. After the first few decades of cultivation, in which fields were rain-fed and rotated between use for rice and use for manure-producing cattle, plantations moved to the inland swamps and tidal marshes. This shift required significant labor transforming the land to enhance irrigation, prevent saltwater encroachment, and allow sufficient drainage. Slaves constructed earthen dikes to surround each field. These dikes, which they called banks, were as tall as a man and up to 15 feet wide. One archaeological historian has estimated that by 1850, the amount of earth moved to construct the banks and canals for the rice fields of Carolina and Georgia was almost 3 times the volume of the world's largest pyramid. And it was all completed by African slaves using simple hand tools and back-breaking effort. But the expertise and labor brought by the West African slaves and the suitability of the climate to rice cultivation led to an explosion of production. In 1698, South Carolina plantations produced 5 tons of rice for export. Just 2 years later, they produced 330 tons. That reached 5,000 tons per year by 1730 and 25,000 tons by 1740. When Portuguese ships began exploring the coastline of Africa in the 15th century, they sought not slaves, but gold and other riches. Successful expeditions returned with wealth and with enslaved Africans. Though initially African slaves were acquired by raids along the coast, European traders quickly established trade relations with local African slavers.
About the wealthy Indians who owned slaves. Mm-hmm. How many were there? How many wealthy Indians were there, and how did they get that way?
Agriculture. The 5 nations of the whole Southeast, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminoles, those were the ones who were going to be most devoted to the institution of slavery, because those were the nations that most eagerly embraced Western civilization. And the tragic irony here is that embracing civilization for many of these folks meant embracing all that represented, including slavery. And once they did, and those who were successful, they would eventually acquire wealth disproportionately to the others. And this is the unfortunate thing. Once slavery was established, and once some people gained control over other people's labor, then they were able to accumulate wealth at a faster rate than others who did not have slave labor. And as a result, these enormous class divisions began to emerge in Indian territory. So